Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Perspectives, where we take a look at current events through the lens of American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. In this episode, we focus on presidents crashing the American economy. President Donald Trump just this past week announced his long-promised global tariff program, and the markets reacted pretty negatively with a big drop over a course of 2 days, 4,000 points lost from the Dow, about a 10% change, and a lot of panic setting into the American economy about sort of what's the future of all of this. Well, we also know that presidents tend to get a lot more blame than they deserve and a lot more praise than they deserve when it comes to the economy. These economic cycles typically take a long time to play themselves out. Sometimes the economy goes up or down. It has nothing to do with presidential policies. It's just the economic cycle. And of course, we have no idea where the Trump administration's policies for tariffs are actually going to lead to the American economy outcomes over the long period. What we do know is we look back at American history, and again, my journey through the presidents thus far, from Washington through Dwight Eisenhower, we could take a look at have we had American presidents who did have economic policies that effectively crashed the American economy. And as I look through history, there's really three that we're going to talk about here in this episode. Let's go back to the beginning of the 19th century. Thomas Jefferson, President of the United States. James Madison is his Secretary of State, and the United States is in trouble. Britain and France are at war, not with the Americans, but with each other. The problem was the Americans were trying to stay neutral, but the French and the British didn't see it that way. They saw the Americans trading with the enemy, and so they were starting to basically confiscate these American commercial ships right there on the water of the Atlantic Ocean, and in particular, the British were also basically kidnapping Americans and impressing them into the British Navy. So what were the Americans going to do about this? Thomas Jefferson was really loath to go for a declaration of war against the British or the French. He didn't think they were militarily ready to do that, and also didn't think it was a good policy. But what could he do instead of just sit around and have all this devastation going on in the high seas? So he and Madison and others in the administration came up with an economic plan, an embargo. And they got Congress to pass the Embargo of 1807 that basically said the U.S. is out of trade business with the international community. And this intent was going to be to make the British and the French suffer. They wouldn't get American supplies. They wouldn't have American customers. They would see the error of their ways, and then they would treat the American shipping neutrally like they should. Well, the problem was that's not what happened. The French and the British actually did fine during the embargo. They found other sources of supply and other customers. They were focused on their wars. The real devastation for the economy was on the American economy. As exports basically fell to near nothing, you had 75, 80, 85% drop in exports at different parts of the country. Devastating for people who their livelihoods were on the line, thousands of Americans who were now basically out of business. And they were almost begging the Jefferson administration after several months of this to bring this terrible policy to an end. Jefferson wasn't having it. He said, "I did not expect a crop of so sudden and rank growth of fraud and open opposition by force could have grown in the United States. Congress must legalize all means which may be necessary to obtain its end." He was doubling down, and he was going to use the military. He was going to use his Navy not to actually go up against the British or the French, to patrol the Atlantic coast against the Americans, almost as a police force to make sure nobody was violating his policies. Now, Jefferson and Madison, of course, came into office with a reputation about looking out for the individual citizen, individual liberty, states' rights, keeping the government out of people's business. And in fact, Madison had made a statement a couple of decades before that was directly on this point. He said at the time that attempts to enforce by legal sanctions acts obnoxious to so great a proportion of citizens tend to enervate the laws in general and to slacken the bands of society. If it be difficult to execute any law which is not generally deemed necessary or salutary, what must be the case where it is deemed invalid and dangerous? And what may be the effect of so striking an example of impotency in the government on its general authority? What happens when you pass a law that really has this negative effect that people don't like it? Well, again, they weren't changing now. They were doubling down. They were using the military to enforce. And after all of this, not only did he crash the American economy, didn't end up avoiding war. He postponed war, but just a couple of years into the Madison administration, after he took over from Jefferson, the Americans did go to war with Britain. So again, it wasn't avoided overall. And the American economy, last couple of years of the Jefferson administration, was really terrible, mainly because of that embargo. Let's move forward a couple of decades now. The seventh president of the United States is Andrew Jackson, another man of the people. who had a very specific set of ideas when it came to the economy. In particular, he despised the national bank. The Bank of the United States he thought was unconstitutional from the beginning, and it was undemocratic, putting these unelected businessmen in charge of so much of what was going on with the American economy. So he was bound and determined to crush this thing, but it had a charter all the way through 1836. He took power as president in 1829. Now, it was an interesting move by the bank's supporters and their president, Nicholas Biddle, who ran the bank. He said, look, let's put up for recharter in 1832. That's our best chance because Jackson's not going to veto the bank. It's very popular, a lot of electoral votes in the North where the bank was located. He said, look, he's not going to veto this thing in an election year. So they put it forward in 1832, and they just didn't know Andrew Jackson because that was not going to stop him. He said, I will prove to them I will never flinch. They are mistaken when they expected to act upon me by such considerations. When that recharter crossed his desk in 1832, he quickly vetoed it. But he wasn't done because the charter still had 4 years to go. And not only did he sign the death warrant, he wanted the execution done for that bank. He wanted it done then and there. So what could he do with 4 years left on the charter? I'll just take the money out. I'll just take the federal funds out of the Bank of the United States and put them somewhere else. Well, this is where Nicholas Biddle again stood up and said, look, you better not do that, Mr. President. They will not dare to remove them, he told Daniel Webster. If the deposits are withdrawn, it will be a declaration of war which cannot be recalled. This worthy president thinks that because he has scalped Indians and imprisoned judges, he is to have his way with the bank. He is mistaken. Well, of course, Biddle was mistaken because Andrew Jackson never stood down when it came to these things. So he decided he was going to take the money out of the federal funds out of the national bank. He had just one problem. The law said only the Secretary of the Treasury could remove those funds. And Jackson's cabinet, in particular, the Secretary of the Treasury, thought this was a terrible idea and it was going to crash the economy. He said, sir, I'm not going to do it. Well, what did he do? Jackson did. Well, he took him out as the Secretary of the Treasury, put in somebody else. The second person also said, sir, I'm not going to do this. This is going to be bad for the economy, bad for the country. Jackson fired him, found his third man as Secretary of the Treasury who withdrew those funds. And in the meantime, though, Nicholas Biddle did act. He still had plenty of other money in his bank, a lot of the economy for the United States running through his bank, and he decided to call in loans, not make new loans, the economy sinking, and Andrew Jackson again doubling down. He told his vice president, the bank, Mr. Van Buren, is trying to kill me, but I will kill it. And sure enough, he did. He took that money out. He put it in the state banks. But what was the impact of all of this? Well, at this point, those state banks now were flush with cash, and they started making lots of loans, speculative loans, risky loans, and this also caused Jackson concern. He despised these sort of paper currency that led to a lot of this speculation, these greenbacks, and so he said, you know what? We're going to get rid of that because we're going to only transact sale of public lands, which was big business in the United States at the time. That's only going to happen with hard currency. No more greenbacks, no more speculation. You're going to have gold, specie, in which to do this. The problem with that was there wasn't enough specie left in the country to actually enable all of these transactions. People started withdrawing gold from the banks and sort of starting to hold on to it. The speculators who had these loans, they had greenbacks, but they couldn't repay because they didn't have the hard currency. Basically, defaults went across all over the place. A lot of pain across the entire American economy led to a full-on panic. Now, not on Jackson's technical watch. It was really his successor, Martin Van Buren, who felt the pain of all this, in part because Van Buren stuck with Jackson's policies. That Specie Circular, he held on to it, kept the money out of the national bank. So Van Buren certainly also to blame for perpetuating these policies, but it was really the policies of Jackson, the killing of the bank, the removing the funds, and the Specie Circular that led to that panic of 1837, directly the result of his economic policies. Our last example, we're going to move ahead to the late 1880s and early 1890s. The President of the United States is Benjamin Harrison, and he had actually run for his campaign on an economic platform focusing on a couple of key issues. One, protective tariff. He was in favor of a protective tariff, and actually after he becomes president, he works with the chair of the Ways and Means Committee in the House, William McKinley, to pass the McKinley Tariff, the highest tariff thus far in American history, which certainly had an impact on the American economy. But the bigger impact on the economy in a negative way was likely the second plank of the policies of Benjamin Harrison, and this had to do with the currency. There was a big push at this time to get more silver into the currency of the United States, not just gold. And Harrison was, in general, he was in favor of this. In fact, he said that I've been an advocate of the use of silver in our currency. We are large producers of that metal and should not discredit it. That said, any safe legislation upon this subject must secure the equality of the two coins in their commercial uses. And that was sort of the rub of all of this. Harrison was fine with silver, but he wanted a fixed ratio between silver and gold, so there was no differences between the two different currencies. The problem was the Silverites, who were really pushing for more silver, actually that was not their vision. They liked silver because it was inflationary against gold. And I realize this gets complicated. We'll try to keep it simple. This notion of bimetallism for the borrowers in the economic cycle, they liked it because they could then borrow in gold, pay back in silver, and because silver would depreciate against gold, they could actually get a discount just by using the different currency. Now again, Harrison was for silver, but he was against this idea of having these slipping ratio of gold to silver. What happened after the Sherman Silver Purchase Act was passed and signed under law by Benjamin Harrison? A lot more silver now coming into the economy. Well, as predicted, that inflationary element kicked in. The 16-to-1 ratio that was sort of the standard for gold to silver at the start of the Harrison administration eroded quickly. It became almost 20-to-1 within just a couple of years, and by the end of his term in office, 26.5-to-1. And even he, frankly, had to admit that his idea about keeping that stable currency, well, that anticipation has not been realized, as Benjamin Harrison noted toward the end of his administration. What was the impact of all of this? Well, again, by getting silver into the marketplace, the American economy, or the Treasury rather, buying that silver with gold, people started to value gold for its stability. A lot of the European countries were taking gold out of the United States. Created all kinds of problems for Harrison's successor, Grover Cleveland. Panic of 1893 kicked in, again, largely because of the economic policies of Benjamin Harrison, somewhat the tariff, and largely, though, associated with the bimetallism policy with the currency. So those, you've got three examples. You've got Jefferson, you've got Jackson, you've got Benjamin Harrison with economic policies that directly led to crashing of the American economy. You might be asking, though, wait a second, what about the Great Depression? Wasn't Herbert Hoover's policy the things that caused the Great Depression in the 1920s? And of course, that was really not the case. And we've got some extensive episodes of Presidential Chronicles videos. I've got the links in the description here. You can get a lot more into sort of the causes of the Depression, Hoover during the Depression, FDR coming along after the fact. But Hoover didn't cause the Great Depression. The speculation in the market leading up to his presidency certainly had a big rise that was basically a bubble that was ready to fall, and the market crashed on his watch. It then led to a number of other economic problems. A global depression kicked in. Unemployment was rampant throughout the United States. And a lot of folks thought that it was Hoover's policies that maybe made things worse for the American economy. Hoover had a pretty clear idea, though, on this. He really didn't want to get the government involved in solving this problem. He thought it was much better American individualism, states' rights, the people, volunteers. That's how we're going to solve this problem. In fact, Hoover said prosperity cannot be restored by raids upon the public treasury. Those who propose otherwise are playing politics at the expense of human misery. Well, doing that was his opponent in the 1932 election, Franklin Roosevelt, who came along with his idea of a New Deal for the American people, which could have involved a lot of spending by the United States. And he certainly was putting the blame for the American suffering on Herbert Hoover during the election. He said the present leadership in Washington stands convicted, not because it did not have the means to plan, but fundamentally because it did not have the will to do. I have charged that he did nothing for a long time after the Depression began. I repeat that charge. It is a leadership that is bankrupt not only in ideals, but in ideas. Now, some of this unfair. In fact, Hoover tried all kinds of things, including, toward the end of his term, more government intervention. Nothing seemed to be working. His unemployment came way up. And Roosevelt comes along. He introduces his New Deal, passes all these laws through Congress, creates all these organizations, spends all this money, and frankly, unemployment didn't get much better. It persisted at a really high level throughout his first two terms in office. It wasn't the New Deal that ended the Great Depression. It was really World War II and the spending associated with that that ended the Great Depression. So again, in looking at the examples where American presidents and their policies crashing the American economy, you can't really say that about Herbert Hoover and the cause of the Great Depression. Whether or not, again, Hoover and Roosevelt policies made that depression last longer is certainly something that a lot of people have looked at. But I think when you look at history from, again, my view from Washington through Eisenhower that I've studied, there's really those three examples where American presidents did enact policies that had a direct and negative impact on the American economy. You've got Thomas Jefferson with his Embargo, Andrew Jackson with the Bank of the United States and the Specie Circular, and the bimetallism, the silver policies of Benjamin Harrison, all leading to economic devastation directly based on their policies on the U.S. economy. That is taking a look at presidents and crashing the American economy. For more on some of these topics, check out some of those links in the description below for other videos from Presidential Chronicles. You can also check out my books on Amazon.com. Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Perspectives from Presidential Chronicles.